After the age of 60, something curious begins to happen in the human body. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. Across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, more adults are living longer than any generation before them. In fact, average life expectancy has increased by more than 30 years over the past century. And yet another statistic tells a different story. The years people live without disability often begin to decline sharply after the early 60s. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why do so many people reach older age but gradually lose the variabilities that make life independent and enjoyable? Walking becomes slower, balance becomes uncertain, energy fades earlier in the day, and what's striking is that much of this decline does not come from catastrophic disease. It emerges from habits so ordinary that most people barely notice them. 5 of them in particular, habits that seem harmless, sensible even, but from an evolutionary perspective, they quietly erode the biological systems that support longevity. And here's the deeper puzzle. Humans are one of the few species on Earth that regularly live decades after reproduction ends. Anthropologists call this a life history anomaly. Our bodies evolved not only to survive into older age, but to remain functionally active within social groups. So why does modern life make that so difficult? That question leads to a realization most people have never been taught. What feels like normal aging is often the result of subtle evolutionary mismatch. Your body is not failing. It is responding exactly as it evolved to. And once you see the underlying design, these 5 habits become much easier to understand and far easier to change. But the first habit begins with something surprisingly simple. Stillness. I'm Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I've spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now I'm here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to The Evolution. If you enjoy exploring how evolutionary science explains the challenges of modern life, consider subscribing. Each episode looks at one puzzle of human biology and what it reveals about the world we now live in. Because the first habit that quietly shortens functional longevity after 60 isn't dramatic at all. It's the slow disappearance of mechanical stress from the body, and that story begins hundreds of thousands of years ago. To understand why certain habits begin to undermine longevity after 60, we have to start with a simple evolutionary principle. Human bodies are built to respond to mechanical stress. Not extreme stress, not athletic training, just regular, everyday loading. Bone, muscle, tendon, and connective tissue all share a remarkable property. They strengthen in response to the forces placed upon them. Biologists call this mechanical adaptation. When a structure experiences repeated load, cells within that tissue signal the body to maintain or reinforce it. But remove that load long enough and the opposite begins to occur. The system slowly dismantles itself. And this leads to a surprising realization. From an evolutionary perspective, the human body is not designed to maintain strength automatically. It is designed to maintain strength only when it is needed, which worked beautifully for most of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, the daily lives of our ancestors required constant, moderate physical engagement. Not structured workouts, not gyms, but steady movement across varied terrain, carrying objects, gathering food, digging, climbing, and walking long distances. Anthropologists studying traditional subsistence populations consistently observe this pattern. Adults often walk between 6 and 9 miles a day. They squat while working. They lift, carry, and shift their body weight frequently. And these activities distribute mechanical stress across the entire musculoskeletal system, not intensely, but persistently. The result is something remarkable. Even into older adulthood, individuals in these populations often retain strong bones, stable joints, and functional mobility. Not because they train like athletes, but because their daily environment continually reminds their bodies that strength is still required. And this is where the evolutionary puzzle begins to emerge. Modern life removes that reminder. Consider a common scenario. A professional in their mid-60s retires after decades of office work. For the first time in years, the schedule becomes more relaxed. Mornings begin with coffee. Afternoons involve reading, television, or time on a computer. Movement becomes optional. It feels well-deserved. And in many ways, it is. But biologically, something subtle begins to shift. Without regular loading, bones receive fewer signals to maintain density. Muscle fibers receive fewer signals to preserve strength. Even the connective tissues that stabilize joints begin to remodel themselves for a lower demand environment. This process is not dramatic. it is quiet, which is exactly why it often goes unnoticed. In the first few years, the changes may appear insignificant. Slight reductions in muscle mass, a bit less balance, climbing stairs feels marginally harder, normal aging, we assume. But the deeper issue isn't what you think. What looks like inevitable decline is often the body simply following its evolutionary instructions. Your physiology constantly asks one question: is this capacity still necessary? If the answer becomes no, because the environment no longer demands strength, stability, or endurance, the body reallocates its energy elsewhere. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Maintaining muscle and bone is metabolically expensive. Natural selection favored organisms that preserved those tissues only when they were actively used. Efficiency mattered, but this efficiency creates a problem no one anticipated. The modern world allows humans to live longer than ever, while simultaneously removing many of the mechanical challenges that once preserved physical function. And that's where the first longevity-killing habit appears. Not inactivity in the dramatic sense, but something far more subtle. Long periods of comfortable sitting. And the consequences begin earlier than most people realize. The first habit that quietly undermines longevity after 60 is not simply inactivity. It is extended sitting without mechanical variation. That distinction matters because the human body did not evolve in an environment where the spine, hips, and legs remained unloaded for hours at a time. Chairs, in evolutionary terms, are a remarkably recent invention. For most of human history, people rested in ways that still involved the musculoskeletal system, squatting near a fire, kneeling while preparing food, sitting on the ground, and frequently shifting posture. Even resting required subtle muscular engagement. Stillness existed, but static stillness was rare, and this is where modern environments introduce a very specific form of mismatch. The modern chair removes load from the lower body, reduces activation of stabilizing muscles, and places the pelvis in a fixed orientation that the human spine did not evolve to maintain for long durations. At first glance, this may appear trivial. After all, sitting feels restful, but the body interprets long periods of unloading in a very particular way. It begins to assume that certain tissues are no longer essential. Research on muscle aging illustrates this clearly. Adults over 60 can lose between 3 and 8% of muscle mass per decade, a process known as sarcopenia. Yet studies consistently show that much of this loss accelerates when muscles experience prolonged disuse rather than simply aging, which leads to an important realization. The body does not primarily respond to age, it responds to demand. Your physiology asks a simple question: what forces am I required to handle? Remove those forces long enough, and the body adapts accordingly. This response makes evolutionary sense. Maintaining muscle is metabolically expensive. Muscle tissue consumes energy even at rest. From a survival perspective, it was efficient to reduce unused tissue during periods when resources were scarce or when physical demands decreased, but the deeper issue isn't muscle alone. The skeletal system responds the same way. Bone is living tissue that remodels itself in response to mechanical stress. When bones experience regular loading, walking, lifting, carrying, microscopic strains signal bone-building cells to reinforce the structure. Without those signals, bone density gradually declines. And this creates a problem no one anticipated in earlier human environments. Because our ancestors rarely experienced decades of reduced mechanical loading, even older adults in subsistence societies typically remain involved in daily tasks, walking to gather resources, carrying water, tending fires, preparing food, caring for grandchildren. Movement persists because the environment requires it. Modern environments do the opposite. They remove the requirement. Consider a realistic example. A 68-year-old retired accountant spends much of his day reading, using a laptop, and watching television. He walks occasionally, perhaps a short stroll around the neighborhood, but the majority of his waking hours involve sitting. From a cultural perspective, this seems entirely reasonable. From a biological perspective, however, the body begins to interpret this environment as one that demands very little physical capacity. Muscle strength slowly declines. Balance reflexes weaken. The stabilizing muscles around the hips and spine become less active. Nothing feels alarming until one day the person notices something small. Standing up from a low chair requires more effort than it once did. And this is where the real misunderstanding begins. Most people assume these changes are the unavoidable consequence of aging itself. But in many cases, the body is simply adapting to a low-demand environment. Your body is not failing. It is responding exactly as it evolved to, which leads to a counterintuitive insight. Longevity is not merely about avoiding disease. It is about maintaining functional capacity, the ability to move, lift, balance, and generate force when required. And the systems that support those abilities must be continually reminded that they are still needed. But extended sitting creates the opposite signal, a signal that quietly tells the body to scale down. And that is only the first habit, because the second habit that often appears after 60 is even more subtle, and in some ways more surprising. It involves something many people believe is healthy, doing only comfortable, predictable movement. And the evolutionary consequences of that habit are rarely discussed. The second habit that quietly undermines longevity after 60 is something that often looks like a healthy routine. Doing the same comfortable movement every day, a short walk on flat pavement, the same gentle exercise class, the same predictable route through the neighborhood. At first glance, this seems exactly what experts recommend. After all, walking is widely recognized as one of the safest and most beneficial forms of physical activity. And it is. But there is an evolutionary detail most people miss. The human body did not evolve to move in perfectly repetitive environments. For most of human history, landscapes were irregular and unpredictable. Surfaces changed constantly. Paths included rocks, slopes, fallen branches, uneven ground, soft soil, and sudden shifts in direction. Movement required continuous adjustment. Small, stabilizing muscles in the feet, ankles, hips, and spine were constantly engaged to maintain balance and coordination, not dramatically, but subtly. Thousands of micro adjustments throughout the day. And those adjustments served an important purpose. They maintained something that becomes increasingly important with age, neuromuscular resilience. This is the ability of the nervous system and muscles to coordinate quickly when balance is challenged. And here's where the modern environment creates an unexpected problem. Our movement patterns have become extremely predictable. Smooth sidewalks, level flooring, escalators and elevators replacing stairs. Even exercise routines often emphasize controlled, repetitive motion, which leads to a surprising realization. The body becomes very good at handling the exact movements it practices, but it gradually becomes less prepared for movements it does not practice. And that's where the real risk emerges. Falls. Among adults over 65, falls are one of the most common causes of injury worldwide. In the United States alone, roughly 1 in 4 older adults experiences a fall each year. But most falls do not occur during exercise. They happen during ordinary moments, stepping off a curb, turning quickly, walking on uneven ground, moments when balance must respond instantly to unexpected forces. And this is where predictable movement patterns can quietly reduce resilience. Your nervous system adapts to the stability of the environment it experiences most often. When surfaces are flat and movement patterns are repetitive, the brain receives fewer opportunities to practice rapid correction. Balance becomes less practiced. Reaction times slow slightly, and the stabilizing muscles that protect joints during sudden shifts receive fewer signals to remain strong. Your body is not weakening randomly. It is adapting to the demands placed upon it, which leads to a culturally contrarian idea. Movement alone is not always enough. Movement variability matters. Your biology evolved in environments that constantly challenged coordination and balance. Irregular terrain, shifting loads, and unpredictable obstacles provided continuous signals to maintain these systems. Modern life, by contrast, smooths the landscape, literally. Flat surfaces are comfortable and safe in many ways, but they also reduce the environmental challenges that once preserved balance well into later life. And this creates a problem most people never consider. A person may walk every day, faithfully, consistently, and still experience gradual declines in stability, because the body is practicing only one narrow form of movement. And this leads to the third habit, a habit that appears responsible and disciplined. But from an evolutionary perspective, it quietly accelerates physical decline after 60, avoiding physical challenge altogether. The third habit that quietly undermines longevity after 60 often comes from a sensible instinct, avoiding strain. Lifting heavy objects feels unnecessary. Carrying groceries in multiple trips feels safer. Asking for help with physically demanding tasks seems prudent. And in some cases, it is. Injury prevention is important, especially as joints become more vulnerable with age. But the evolutionary story introduces a nuance that many people overlook. The human musculoskeletal system evolved to handle occasional physical challenge, not constant maximal effort, but periodic demand that requires muscles, bones, and connective tissues to generate force. And this is where modern caution can become biologically misleading, because when the body rarely experiences higher levels of mechanical load, it begins to reduce its capacity to produce force. Muscle fibers that are responsible for strength, particularly fast twitch fibers, gradually shrink when they are not regularly activated. These fibers are not only important for lifting heavy objects, they are critical for something far more relevant to aging, preventing sudden loss of balance. When a person trips or slips, the body must generate force quickly to stabilize itself. That rapid response relies heavily on muscle fibers designed for short bursts of power. But those fibers are among the first to decline when physical challenge disappears from daily life. And this leads to an evolutionary paradox. The very instinct to avoid strain in order to protect the body can gradually reduce the body's ability to protect itself. Your physiology is not trying to betray you. It is following its instructions. For most of human history, physical challenges were unavoidable: carrying firewood, lifting stones to clear a path, hauling water containers, digging roots from hard soil. These activities required intermittent strength, not athletic performance. Just occasional effort that reminded the body that force production remained necessary, and this signal had profound biological effects. Mechanical loading stimulates bone remodeling. It maintains tendon stiffness. It preserves neuromuscular coordination. But when those signals disappear, the body adapts. Strength declines quietly, which leads to a moment many people experience in their late 60s or 70s. A suitcase that once felt manageable suddenly feels heavy. A grandchild becomes difficult to lift. Opening a tight jar requires surprising effort. These moments often feel like signs of aging, but the deeper issue isn't simply time passing. It is the gradual absence of meaningful mechanical challenge. Your body is not failing. It is responding exactly as it evolved to. And this realization leads to an important shift in perspective. Longevity is not just about gentle activity. It is about maintaining a spectrum of capacity: endurance, balance, coordination, and strength. Each system requires occasional reminders that it is still needed. Without those reminders, the body begins to economize, and that quiet process sets the stage for the fourth habit, a habit that almost no one recognizes as biologically significant: remaining indoors for most of the day. The fourth habit that quietly erodes longevity after 60 is surprisingly common: spending most of the day indoors. At first glance, this may not seem connected to physical decline. After all, indoor environments are comfortable, climate-controlled, and safe. They remove many of the physical stresses that once made daily life difficult. But that comfort introduces an evolutionary mismatch that affects multiple systems in the body, because humans did not evolve in sealed environments. For nearly all of our species' history, daily life unfolded outdoors. Light levels changed across the day. Temperatures fluctuated. Wind, terrain, and distance shaped movement patterns. Even simple tasks like gathering food or walking between locations exposed the body to a wide range of environmental signals. And those signals mattered. One of the most important is natural light. Sunlight regulates the body's circadian rhythms, the internal timing system that coordinates sleep, hormone production, metabolism, and cellular repair. When the eyes receive strong natural light during the day, this clock synchronizes more effectively with the external world. But modern indoor lighting is dramatically dimmer than outdoor light. A bright office may reach 500 lux. Outdoor daylight often exceeds 10,000. That difference changes how the brain regulates energy, sleep timing, and alertness. And this leads to a subtle but important shift. People who spend most of their day indoors often experience weaker circadian signals. Sleep becomes slightly more fragmented. Energy fluctuates more unpredictably. Motivation for physical activity declines. Not dramatically, but gradually. Your body is not becoming less disciplined. It is responding to a weaker environmental rhythm. And sunlight is only part of the story. Outdoor environments naturally encourage small bursts of movement. Uneven terrain requires balance adjustments. Temperature variation prompts subtle metabolic responses. Even walking outdoors tends to involve more variation in pace and posture. Indoors, by contrast, the environment becomes remarkably uniform. Temperature remains stable. Surfaces are flat. Lighting barely changes. Many daily tasks occur within a few steps of each other. From an evolutionary perspective, this creates a low stimulation landscape for the body. The nervous system receives fewer cues to adjust posture, maintain alertness, or engage the musculoskeletal system dynamically, and this leads to a quiet biological consequence. The body begins to operate at a lower level of readiness. Your physiology assumes that the environment requires less engagement, which leads to an insight many people find surprising. Longevity is not supported by comfort alone. It is supported by environmental richness, light, movement variability, changing temperatures, and subtle physical challenges that keep biological systems responsive. Your instincts evolved for a world that constantly stimulated the senses in the body. Modern indoor life removes much of that stimulation. And that brings us to the fifth habit, a habit that feels like well-earned rest. But from an evolutionary perspective, it sends a powerful signal that the body is no longer required to remain robust, gradually withdrawing from purposeful activity. The fifth habit that quietly shortens functional longevity after 60 is not purely physical, it is behavioral, gradually withdrawing from purposeful activity. This often happens subtly after major life transitions. Retirement arrives, long careers conclude, daily schedules become open in ways they have not been for decades. At first, the freedom feels deserved, and in many ways, it is. But human beings evolved in social environments where older adults rarely stopped contributing to group life. Anthropological evidence from small-scale societies shows that elders often remain deeply involved in food preparation, knowledge transmission, childcare, tool repair, and conflict mediation. Their roles change, but their participation continues. And this participation carries biological consequences. Purposeful activity creates natural demands on both the body and the brain. Tasks require movement, planning, coordination, memory,